Hi guys, this is our IDA navigation lab. I have 3 goals for you in this lab. The first is I want you to be comfortable navigating in IDA. Specifically, I want you to be able to identify imports and locate them in the code. I also want you to be comfortable pivoting between IDA and the Microsoft documentation to look up API calls. And lastly, I want you to understand how parameters are passed into function calls and how return values come back out. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to work with the same sample that we've been working with in these demos. And I'll just drag and drop into IDA. So I have a list of imports that I want to look at. So we're going to go to this import tab over here in the upper right. You can scroll through these and you can look at any of them, but for this demo we're going to start by looking at a import is user in admin. So to find that, I'm going to click into this frame, Control F, and type is user, and there's my call. So now I'm going to double click that, click on its definition right here, so that's highlighted, and hit X. It's a hotkey for XREFs, cross references. And then I'm just going to double click on this first one that's defined. And that takes me to the location in code where that call is made. So we don't see any parameters going into it, obviously, at least. So let's go ahead and look it up in our documentation. So we will pull up a window and search is user in admin. And go visit the docs.microsoft.com. And so we can see, sure enough, this function doesn't take any parameters. All it does is return a Boolean value, so either true or false, based on whether the user is a member of the administrator group. So let's go take a look back at our code. So we know that functions return values in EAX, and so here we see this call to test EAX. This is a way to see if EAX equals 0 or not, and then we can see that we jump based on the result of this operation. So that makes sense. We make a call that is user and admin, and then based on the result of that call, we either go this way or that way. Very common pattern in malware and goodware. So let's go look at another API call. So again, we'll use our Control F and we'll clear out our old search, and we're going to look for get computer name. And there's our call. We'll double click it, highlight its definition, hit X for cross-refs, and go to this first use. Pay no attention to any of this nonsense. I'm not expecting you guys to understand code. I don't want you guys to try to understand code right now. All I want you to focus on is the API calls, what goes in, and what comes out. So it looks like we have 2 parameters going in with 2 pushes leading up to this call. So let's take a look at our documentation and see if that matches. Get computer name A. And sure enough, this takes 2 parameters. So I chose this one in particular because I want to talk about this parameter. In this case, we are passing in an empty buffer and asking the API to fill it with something, in this case the name of the computer. You can think of that as handing a container to this API call and expecting to get the container back with something in it. If you have a C background, that's the same concept as pass by reference parameters. And so get computer name A doesn't return a string in the traditional sense, but it does in that this parameter gets filled with a string. Its actual return value, though, is simply if it succeeds, it'll return a non-zero value. If it fails, it will return a 0. The second parameter is the size. When you're dealing with character arrays, which are strings, it's important that you always have a size. And so there you go. So if we come back over here, we can see we give it a size, we give it a buffer. It, in turn, returns a value into EAX, and we already discussed that test is used to determine whether the register holds a 0 or not, and then we can see we jump dependent on that register. In this case, if it holds a 0, we're going to go this way and call get last error. The malware wants to know why this call failed. If it's successful, we're going to go this way and keep doing other stuff. All right. And you don't need to understand that logic of this jump not 0. Just know that it tests to see if it was successful or not, and then control flow goes in different directions based on whether or not it was successful. Let's go back to our imports, and let's look for a call to CreateFile, which is the last one, series actually in this case, that we're going to look at. Double click it, highlight its definition, use the X hotkey. In this case, to demo what I want to demo, we're going to go to this one in particular. And so we can see that this is a slightly larger, more complex function than what we've looked at so far. It looks like it takes a whole bunch of parameters here. So as we've been doing, let's go ahead and look up the documentation for CreateFile. And we can see everything defined. Now what I want to highlight here is that some of these hex values that are passed in, for example, this for lots of zeros hex for DW desired access, or this 2 for shared mode, those hex values don't mean anything intuitively. 2 doesn't tell me what the share mode is, but the documentation defines each of these things. So in this case, let's look at DW share mode. If we come down to DW share mode, we can see that each of these hex values is defined. This is where we had a hex 2, which maps to the constant file underscore share underscore write, and then you can read here what that means. In some instances, the options for a parameter are so huge that you'll actually get a link in the documentation to another page where each of the valid hex values are defined, and just follow that link and look for the hex value that's in your code. And I know you have to do that in at least one of your labs, so I did want to mention it. Okay, so let's look at the return value of CreateFile A. So scrolling all the way down, return value. If the function succeeds, the return value is an open handle to the specified file. Okay, cool. So if we come over here, CreateFile A, we know that it returns into EAX. This is a little bit more complicated. We're moving our EAX into EDI. So now our handle, assuming it succeeded, is in EDI. And then we're comparing EDI to hex all F, which would never be a valid handle. And then if it's an invalid, if this function failed, we're going to jump this way. If it succeeded, we're going to jump this way. So I wanted to demo this in particular because I wanted to show you again these hex values for parameters, and that you can translate that into human readable names. And it's our first function call that doesn't just return a 0 or a 1, it actually returns a value. And what I want to point out is that that value goes into EAX, it goes into EDI. If we highlight EDI and look at where it's used, we actually see it down here being pushed into the call to write file. So this is a very common pattern that you'll see where one API call is used to get a value, which is then subsequently pushed into another API call. You'll get really big chains of this, especially with network connections and things like that, that require a lot of specific information. So let's look this up and make sure that this call to write file takes this handle and what we think is happening is really happening here. And so there's our first parameter, and we see HFile. If we read here, it takes a handle to the file or I/O device, and the HFile parameter must have been created with write access, which we could go look at the parameters of our CreateFile and prove that this was. The two most interesting parameters here are the handle itself and this LP buffer, because that's going to actually contain the data to be written. So if you're trying to figure out what your malware is writing, that's what you want to look at. A pointer to the buffer containing the data to be written to the file or device. Alright, so I know this can be an overwhelming lab for some people, especially if you've never looked at assembly before. I want you to try your best to stay focused on what goes into the call and what comes out of it, and not focus on trying to understand what's actually happening beyond that. I'm just trying to get you looking in IDA and working with API calls specifically. We'll do a little more a little later.